Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Chris Deeran. I'm director of Enlighten, formerly known as Reform Scotland. And today's discussion is about, I guess, what you'd call one of the hotter topics in UK and increasingly Scottish politics, namely immigration. We're delighted to be joined by Professor Brian Bell, who is chair of the UK's Migration Advisory Committee, often known as the MAC. The MAC provides independent advice to the government on immigration policy, particularly on the shortage occupation list. It's an understatement, I think, to say that immigration, whether legal or illegal, is ever out of the headlines. It's also rising in saliency across Scotland as the next Holyrood election approaches, perhaps driven mainly by the rise of reform, both north and south of the border. Today, we're going to talk about the challenges and opportunities immigration offers us north of the border, but also about the attempts by various UK governments to wrestle with the issues that immigration presents. So net migration, the impact of migration on the economy, labour markets and employer behaviour, and its effect on higher education, social care, and more. So just to introduce Professor Bell a bit more, he's a leading labour economist. His work on immigration has included papers examining the progress of immigrants in the labour market in the UK and the impact of immigration on crime in the UK. He is a professor of economics at King's Business School. He's also worked extensively outside academia, including at the Bank of England, the International Monetary Fund, and then a number of financial companies in the UK. That's quite the CV, Brian. Slightly humbling. So what we'll do is, as usual, we'll have a chat, and then we'll take your questions. So please send any questions you have over using, or points you want to make, using the chat function on Zoom, and we'll get through as many as we can. So first, Brian, welcome. And I've given a little touch of what the MAC is, but I wonder if you could outline in a bit more detail what the role of the organisation is.
Yeah, so of course we're a bunch of academics. I don't think we have to be academics, but we all are. So there's five of us on the committee at the moment. Slightly smaller than normal, but that's just the public appointments are always difficult to get through. So we advise the Home Secretary on essentially any aspect of the immigration system, although in practice, the tendency has been for Home Secretaries to ask us about work routes in particular, student routes, and this year we published a report on the family route as well. We tend not to advise on irregular migration and asylum, primarily just because our expertise is more focused on the economics and social science side of things rather than on what is often a legal issue relating to asylum. We work very much to the Home Secretary, so she essentially asks us for a piece of work. And then we go ahead and do research and give her advice. I guess the one area where we're slightly different, perhaps than other kind of advisory bodies, is although we are completely advisory and nothing that we do changes rules unless the Home Secretary wants it to, is that we do end up making recommendations that are explicitly, we think you should change the law in this way. So there is a direct link between what we advise and how the law then subsequently changes, because as long as the Home Secretary accepts our advice, that then gets fed through into normally secondary legislation that is required to change the system. So there is more of a kind of a direct policy link there, but it's always for the Home Secretary to accept or reject what we say. And then finally, just to say that if the Home Secretary doesn't ask us to do anything, if in the magical world it's a quiet period in immigration and she doesn't want advice on anything, we can do our own work as well. So in the past we've done work where partly just adding to the research base, so furthering general knowledge about immigration, but also sometimes last couple of years ago we looked at the seasonal worker scheme. Because it had been running for a few years, no one had reviewed it properly, and so we decided to do our own review of that, which was just because it was a reasonably, moderately quiet time at that point. Certainly not at the moment.
Yeah, no, indeed. And what is the role of Scotland, the Scottish government, and Scotland's needs in your processes?
So, I mean, it's obviously immigration is a reserved matter. And so our policy recommendations are for the UK as a whole. I guess from the committee's perspective, we always think about all areas of the UK. We think about the national picture, but then we also want to understand where there are particular challenges at more local levels. And so that's either the devolved nations or the regions of England. And so we'll always be looking at where we might make we might be tempted to make a recommendation at the national level, but then actually spot that might cause more severe problems in some areas than others, and we might want to offset that. Sometimes not. We might want to say that's just how the cookie crumbles. You've got to set a national policy, and that will have differential impacts across areas. But sometimes it may actually push us to be more liberal or more restrictive, depending on what we see at the more localized level is. We have a member of the committee, and we very explicitly, the previous government wanted to expand our kind of our expertise within the committee on devolved nations. And so there was a long discussion as to how we were going to do that. And the way that we did it was that the previous one of the members of the committee that's now on was appointed with us, and the deal was that there was a remit where they would have either expert knowledge of the sort of the issues facing devolved nations, or be involved or be resident in one of the devolved nations. So we have one member of the committee who lives in Scotland. That's not, and crucially, it's not a representative of the devolved nation. They are a full member of the committee and are expected to think broadly on immigration policy, but they bring more experience than perhaps the overall committee in terms of devolved nation issues. We also have a secretariat who advises the civil servants who work for us to help us. And we now have a devolved nation in each of the devolved nations of the UK, so that we have that direct link at the official level between what we're doing and what the Scottish Government are doing. And obviously, I talk to the Scottish Government on a regular basis. Whenever we get a new commission from the Home Secretary, one of the first things I always do is have meetings with ministers in the devolved nations to talk to them about the commission and sort of hear their concerns, and often ask them, who should we be talking to? So, if a particular issue comes up, so I talked to Scottish Minister only a couple of weeks ago about a review we're currently doing, and saying, are there people we're missing if we don't speak to such and such in Scotland? And it's really for the Scottish Government then to say to us, yes, you must talk to X, Y, and Z, and we're always happy to do so.
How do you weight Scotland in your calculations? I guess all of the devolved nations, but immigration has been a totemic issue south of the border for many, many years, perhaps less so up here. But the Scottish Government is telling you, particularly around the occupation shortage list, about what the Scottish economy could do with in terms of immigration. So when you're trying to manage a whole country's immigration system as one, if you like, how do you juggle those maybe competing demands at times?
Yeah. And so I think, if I'm entirely honest, I think part of the answer is, well, they count because they're part of the UK, and they count in that sense. But I don't think of the policy as being, it's more important that we do what Scotland wants than what we do the North East wants. So I don't think that's reasonable when we're giving a UK-wide policy. There's there's clearly a tension there, in that the UK government wants particular policies on immigration, that the Scottish Government may want something quite different. We kind of, in one sense, we just sort of put our hands up and say that's not our problem. We report to the Home Secretary. She's deciding immigration policy. Whether it is a reserved or a devolved matter is entirely for politicians to decide, and we'll work with whatever the current rules are. So I think we don't give Scotland any more weight than we would the rest of the UK, including the regions of England. But I think it is really important that we do often recognise that there will be issues that will be not very important at a national level, but might be really important at those more localized levels. So, to give you an example, if you think of an occupation, suppose we were looking at some occupation, we might end up saying, look, this really isn't very important to the UK. And so why would we have, a particular rule about this? But then we might say, but actually 70% of the employment in that occupation is in Scotland or in Cornwall. And actually we do care about that. And it would be wrong to have a national policy that said, overall, it doesn't really matter for the UK if it matters really a lot in certain areas. And there's no often, particularly if there's no harm to the rest of the UK, if we do something slightly different for that occupation to reflect that difference across areas.
I suppose, as I touched on earlier, the UK has had a complex relationship with the issue of immigration over many decades, and you've obviously been studying it in all its forms for many years. Is immigration a more controversial subject in the UK than in other countries? Is it something to do with the island nation cliche? I know that obviously it's become more of an issue on the continent as well, and elsewhere, with maybe the rise of sort of populist politics, it's in maybe public unhappiness. But how would you judge this sort of, how would you describe the UK's relationship with its immigrants and immigration?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, some things are just other countries would find bizarre. So one thing, for example, is the idea of talking about net migration and the numbers doesn't really occur in most of the countries. I mean, if you went to Germany and France and said, "Oh, what's the net migration statistic this year?" they sort of wouldn't know what you were talking about. I mean, they publish it and it's available, but it's not a big kind of. So that's kind of quite interesting that we focus on this, this net migration measure much more than other countries do. I mean, in one sense, of course, the story is very similar in all advanced economies. I mean, if you look at the share of people born abroad in the UK, it's about where the average of the OECD is. It's sort of about 15% of the population was born abroad. That's pretty standard. It's a little bit lower in France. It's a lot higher in Switzerland. It's a lot higher in Australia and Canada. So, there are some countries where it's a lot higher. There's some countries where it's a little bit lower. There aren't many countries, advanced economies, where it's really low. I mean, the only one I can probably think of is Japan, where there's quite a low share for often cultural, historic reasons. So we're sort of in the pack in terms of where we are, very similar to the US in terms of the share of migrants in the population. There's part of the reason I think for the focus is that it is true that over the last 15 to 20 years, the growth of that has been faster in the UK than in other countries. So although we're now sort of in the middle of the pack, that's come from it's because we've grown quite a bit faster than other countries in the last 20 years. And I think a lot of the focus is probably not so much on where the level is, it's how you get there. And I think, you saw this in some sense with the net migration statistics just before the last election when they reached 900,000 in a year, and there was sort of panic across Whitehall and certainly in the Conservative Party. And I think part of the reason for that was not that it meant that we were completely overwhelmed in the country. It was more just that's an awful lot to add in 1 year. And if the numbers were smoother, it's much easier to adjust and to build more houses and to deal with public stuff. It's quite difficult to do it when it's fast. And so I think some of the pressure in the last few years has been we've had very fast growth, and that's much harder to deal with, even if you end up at the same place. But the other thing I would say is that often the debate misses some international comparisons that are really quite salient. So, the one that kind of just because it's in the news at the moment is obviously kind of the number of people coming on small boats and more generally claiming asylum. And if you look at the number of people claiming asylum in the last 12 months in the UK, we're fifth in Europe in terms of asylum claims, which is roughly about right, given the size of our population. But, it's significantly less than France. It's way less than Germany. I mean, Germany, we have 100,000 claims a year. Germany had 250,000 in the last year. So, and if you rank by population, if you divide by the size of the country, we're 17th in Europe. So, I think often that international comparison is really useful to say, we're not, if you listen to the news, you'd think we were taking asylum applicants far more than the rest of Europe and far more than, and that's just not true. And so it's quite helpful often to put it in that context.
And obviously Brexit was a big moment in terms of our relationship with Europe, but in terms of our relationship with immigration. And I wonder if you could reflect a bit on how Brexit's changed the nature of immigration to the UK, numbers, type, country of origin, what the overall trends are in the UK since 2016 or thereafter.
Yeah, well, it certainly made our job busier because, before, I mean, in some sense, before Brexit happened, immigration wasn't very important from a policy side, because freedom of movement meant that, there wasn't really much point in worrying too much about the rules on immigration for anyone else. Because if you wanted workers, if you wanted students, they could just come from Europe and there was no restriction. So, I mean, you've seen an inevitable change. I mean, the one change that was utterly inevitable, entirely predictable, although perhaps people didn't really think about it, was there's been a massive change in the country of origin mix of people who come into the UK. I mean, that's just inevitable in a world in which you gave freedom of movement to 500 million people. I mean, obviously, most of them didn't want to move, but theoretically, that was the sort of the population of Europe that could move to the UK. And now you're saying we're going to have an immigration system that's broadly blind about nationality. Well, that opens up 8 billion people instead of 500 million. And so it's inevitable that we were going to get more people coming from the more populous countries around the world, particularly those that had historic links, because those sort of things matter when it comes to deciding whether to migrate or not. And so it's inevitable that we were going to get more applications from India, from Pakistan, from Nigeria. partly because they're just much bigger countries in terms of population than the countries of Europe, and because we had those historic ties. And then, of course, on the student side, we've got the Chinese students as well. So I think that mix was an inevitable change. It's probably quite a bit surprising how much that change has. If I'd had a looking glass, I'd have probably predicted a bit more EU migration still, because distance matters as well. It's much easier to come from France to the UK than it is to come from India. But actually, that hasn't happened as much. And so we've actually tilted much more. The other reason that that's happened, I think, is that certainly on the work side, because there's been somewhat more liberalization to more lower paying jobs, those jobs are more attractive to people who are coming from countries that are poorer than us. And so it's not very attractive to a French person to say, oh, you can come to the UK and earn the minimum wage. Because, why would you do that if you live in France? That's much more attractive if you're offering the minimum wage to someone who comes from a country where average wages are below our own minimum wage. And so, you see that a lot. I mean, just as an anecdote, you see that a lot in the seasonal worker program. We have lots of people who come from Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and it seems very random. It's like, well, why do people come from there to the seasonal worker program? And the reason is that when you speak to them, they sort of say, if I do that for 3 years running, if I come for 6 months for 3 years in a row, I can basically earn enough, even though it's not very well paid work, to basically buy a house back home or to start a business and to fundamentally change their way of life. And so inevitably, as you kind of open up the market more, particularly, as I say, at lower wages, you do attract a different group of people who are incentivized in a different way.
Just thinking a bit about what the politicians have tried to do with immigration over, say, the last decade or so, but the last Conservative government always talked about reducing net migration to the tens of thousands, but it never got anywhere near that, did it? Why not?
Well, it was a stupid. I mean, at the time that they had that policy, they didn't control net migration. So, I mean, of all the silly things to do, when we were in the European Union, to promise a number on migration was very silly, because we literally didn't control who from Europe came. There was no legal power to stop Europeans entering the country and staying here. So if you can't control the numbers, don't have a policy that, Now that's less compelling. Now, with a few exceptions, if you want to stay for any length of time in the UK, you need a visa. And so the Home Office technically controls entirely the entry into the UK. There's a few, particularly kind of some of the EU citizens who have reserved rights from leaving. But generally that's right. And so the Home Office can control the number coming in much more accurately now, and much more forcefully if it wishes to. It still can only partially control the exits. We can't, when you come in on a visa, there are terms and conditions to those visas, but those terms and conditions are often in the long run, you can stay and you can get settlement and you can indefinite leave to remain and stay in the UK. Once you get settlement, immigration can't do anything. The Home Secretary can't do anything about you once you've got indefinite leave to remain, because you're outside the immigration system and you're settled. So we can't control the numbers that leave. Now, you can do a certain amount. You could change the rules. So you could say, instead of being able to stay for 5 years, you can only stay for 2 years. And that means that we'll have more control on the exits as well. So I think now it makes more sense to think about, if you want to have a target, at least you control more of the levers. The problem is that the stuff moves around for very random reasons. And it's probably not a very good idea if you're a politician to promise a number if shocks hit you. I mean, the really good example, I think, from the last few years has been the Ukraine scheme, which I don't think there was a single politician who said we shouldn't be really generous to Ukraine citizens and open up a scheme to help them settle in the UK while the war's going on. So I don't think anyone said no to that. But it's amazing how very few people seem to have said, and that will increase net migration. It's as if by some magic, these people were going to enter and somehow not increase the size of the population. I mean, it's like, there's often that magical thinking going on. And, so if you'd had a target for net migration at that point, you'd have either had to say, oh, well, we're going to let in a couple of 100,000 Ukrainians. So we're going to ban migration for everything else. Students will all have to leave. No workers can come in. We could do that. It would be phenomenally harmful to the UK. But we could, or you would say, well, this year we're going to make an exception and we're going to have an extra 200,000. But probably each year you'd be making an exception for one reason or another. And so actually, I think it's better to think about the longer term. And I think that's sort of what the Home Secretary is now doing. And he's thinking not about a set number, but thinking about, have we got the set of policies in place that will get the sort of levels in the long run that we are comfortable with? And if not, how should we tinker with policy to get the number either higher or lower, without promising that in this particular year I will get a particular number? Because I think that's just a fool's errand.
I mean, it's I think it feels like almost every week Yvette Cooper's now having to introduce some kind of new policy or crackdown or whatever. And you're right about that, thinking about the long term, but being the Home Secretary, which is probably the worst job in government, I think you're also having to react on a daily basis to whatever the latest immigration-related crisis is. How would you characterise how this government's going about its business on that issue? I mean, it's certainly right at the forefront, perhaps more at the forefront of their agenda than they expected it to be.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty certain the Home Secretary always expected immigration to be high on the list of public concerns. I think the thing that, and I'm sure this hasn't surprised her, but the thing that's almost inevitable under the current circumstances is that small boats get much more attention and focus than they warrant in the pure statistical numbers. So, small boat entries are about 40,000 a year over the last few years. At various points, we've had net migration 900,000. It's still 400,000 a year. So in terms of the overall picture, we get this distorted idea. And you see this in opinion polls as well. There are, opinion polls have been done which say that sometimes even a majority, but often of quite a significantly large minority of British people think that small boats are the majority of the people who are entering the UK. Whereas in fact, it's about 5% of the people who are entering the UK are on small boats. And so, there's that distortion. Now, I would say that it's important to recognize that there is a clear distinction. People who enter on visas are entering legally into the United Kingdom. People on small boats are entering illegally. I don't think there's anything wrong with politicians saying they are different things. And we have a set of rules in place and we expect people to comply with those rules. And so it is right that we treat those different types of migration differently. I think the one thing that the government have got right so far is an understanding that there is no simple, quick fix to anything like this, both on small boats, but actually on migration more broadly. And that actually, although it's less politically exciting and it won't grab headlines, chipping away at different areas is almost certainly the right way. If you want to reduce either legal or illegal migration, if there was a magical solution, I mean, sometimes you sort of hear these. I mean, Kemi Badenoch was on the radio the other day where I think she said something along the lines of, oh, if I was the Prime Minister, small boats would be zero, perhaps not today or tomorrow, but within a few days or a few weeks. She basically was saying she could get it to zero very, very quickly. I think that's wrong. I also wonder why, if she has that fabulous plan, why she didn't mention it when she was in the cabinet, because it seems odd that she kept this policy secret. I assume that, it sounds very strange. But that's not how this is going to work. This is going to work. The way that you deal with small boats is you make a collection of changes that cumulatively will reduce the number of small boats. So, the agreement, for example, which I think is an excellent agreement with France, the returns agreement that they have with France, that isn't going to suddenly go, as we've seen, it doesn't suddenly reduce the number from 40,000 to zero. But over time, it will chip away at those numbers, dealing with, as we've just seen today's announcement on family reunification, will somewhat reduce the incentive to come. So I think there's a whole collection of different policies that the government are trying. And I think that's true on legal migration as well, where, again, what the Home Secretary has tried to do is to say, well, actually, we can reduce numbers somewhat on the work route, we can reduce numbers somewhat on the student route, nothing dramatic, but overall, when you add up the numbers, you get to something significant. That's much better than saying, oh, I have some magical wand that can just reduce net migration by 100,000 tomorrow. They don't really exist.
Yeah. Obviously, the small boats and maybe some confusion over legal versus illegal immigration or whatever. So the subject of immigration is something of a controversial reputation at the moment. The upside, of course, is that you get people coming in and hopefully contributing to economic growth and cultural enrichment and the rest of it. But how would you characterise the impact of immigration on? I mean, it's not like the economy is growing like topsy, but what are the benefits that we've seen from immigration over the past decade or so?
Yeah, so I think I would put it into two different groups. First of all, there's the sort of often the unmeasurable but important things like the cultural kind of context, that, that having a mixed society, a more diverse society, there are real benefits to that, which are hard to measure, but I think they're there. The economic side of it, I think it's one of those classic examples where there are almost like two sides to the debate, pro and con migration, and neither of them can be realistic about the contribution. So you get people who sort of say, oh, it doesn't matter whether we have any migrants, we can have zero and the economy will still be fine. That's almost certainly not true. But it's also not true that they are the lifeblood of the economy, and without them, the entire economy would collapse. Again, only 15% of people were born abroad. Are we really saying that without those 15% of people, the other 85% of people would suddenly sit around and do nothing and produce nothing? That Brits just can't do anything unless there's a migrant there to help them along in their jobs? The reality is, and it's boring and it's kind of non-headline grabbing, is migrants by and large are just like us. They're about as productive as we are. They're about as good as their jobs as we are. There'll be some migrants who are really great at their job. There'll be some who you wish you'd never employed. That's just, they're nothing very exciting relative to us. Therefore, when we talk often about migration, all we're talking about is, do we make the economy and the population bigger or smaller? And so if we get more migrants coming in, we have a bigger population, the economy will be bigger, but none of us will individually be much better off per person. It's just the economy's bigger. And there are some advantages to that, from a fiscal perspective. If the economy is bigger, then, our debt to GDP ratio goes down because GDP goes up. And initially, at least, the debt doesn't change. So that kind of helps a bit. But it's sort of not, the reason for that is actually quite straightforward. It's that we're an advanced economy. We're one of the most successful economies. People forget this, but we are one of the most successful economies in the world. Our GDP per person is very high relative to the vast majority of countries. Perhaps not as high as we want it to be, but we are in the elite group of advanced economies. It's quite difficult to get migration that can fundamentally change that productivity, our innovation, because we're already doing really well there. Relatively. It's much easier if you're a really poor country to use migration to help you grow really fast, because you can bring in lots of skills that you really don't have. So if you're a poor country, you actually can really benefit from bringing in really high skilled people that your economy can't really train themselves because you don't have, massive amounts of universities or that kind of thing. And so you can actually bring those people in and they can really stimulate growth and entrepreneurship and the like. It's much harder to do when you're in the UK, where, we've got 3 or 4 of the top 10 universities are in the UK. We're already producing lots of great graduates and everything. Does that mean that we can't get a really great French graduate? Yeah, we will be able to. And sometimes they'll be better than a British graduate, but often they'll just be exactly the same. And so, that can't help us grow very fast. And so, there are real benefits to bringing in migrants, but we shouldn't overstate them. The one thing I would say is that one area where you do see a clear benefit is on our main work route, the skilled worker route into the UK. One area you see an awful lot of is we do bring in lots of really very highly paid people from abroad. And here, I think there is an element of, we take advantage of the fact that London in particular is a major financial and business centre in the world, and actually brings in lots of people from New York, from Singapore, from kind of Tokyo, lots of different places where actually we're bringing in really high paying workers. They're not displacing British workers. It's just that they're adding to that massive kind of very high paid work. And that brings in really significant tax revenues. So there is a real point at the sort of the top of the distribution of people we're bringing in are really helping from a fiscal perspective relative to the average.
And that separation between high skilled and low skilled immigrants is something that can be a bit controversial at times, especially at the sort of lower end of the skills matrix, if you like. We know that, for example, in the care sector, which is in crisis, there are too few care workers to meet demand. Demand's rising because of an aging population, and a significant proportion of care workers are migrants. But I think Yvette Cooper's quite keen for that not to be the case. So there is the debate about, well, one, they're not very well paid jobs, but two, there are lots of people who are indigenous, from what of a better word, who are not working, who could be working and might be doing these jobs. Is that one of the things that is driving the kind of sentiment about immigration in the country at the moment, that people see these people coming in and being, maybe, although they're doing important jobs, they're not the kind of high-end performers in key industries that you mentioned?
Well, interestingly, I think I think there's an awful lot of truth to what you say. It's not necessarily what you see in public opinion polls. So one thing that's quite interesting, which I always always think is quite funny, is that when you ask people, do they want more or less migration? The majority sort of say they want either less or about the same. So there is some pressure to bring net migration down from from the public. But then you ask them particular types of workers or particular types of migrants, are you in favour or not of those? One interesting thing is that actually care workers, the majority are quite comfortable for them to come in because they recognise the important work they do. The group that they're usually the most negative about in terms of coming in are bankers. So they think that basically we should, if we're going to close now it's not as if we bring in lots of them. I think perhaps they're confused as to how many we bring in, but they often sort of say, oh, bankers, no, we shouldn't be bringing them in. Of course, what they sort of forget, and this is why it's always really complex, these sort of things to think through, is what they're really saying is we want to pay higher taxes. Because bankers are the ones who are helping our fiscal position the most, whether we like it or not. They're paying enormous amounts of income tax and they're not taking many public services. So if you want to cut down on bankers coming into the UK, you do have to say that you want to pay higher taxes. And that's not what people really think about, but that's what the implication is. In terms of the policy itself, I think look, my view has always been that it's almost never immigration that's the cause of the problem. So no one thinks that immigration is the cause of the problem in social care. We sort of all understand what the problem is in social care. It's not funded correctly. It's really badly paid work for what is really hard work. And we sort of benefit from the fact that there are lots of people in the country who want to do that work and get real pleasure from it and want to do it. And the problem is there aren't enough of those people who, as it were, you can, in a small e, but you can exploit them by saying, oh, well, you really love this work, so we can continue to pay it badly, but you'll still do it because you love it. There aren't enough of those people to do the actual work that needs to be done. So you have to make it attractive to people who have are happy to do, will do it, but will think of other jobs. And the problem is, why would you work in social care at the minimum wage when Aldi is around the corner paying £1 or £2 more an hour to stack shelves? Some people will do it because they really love the work, but there's not enough of them. And so that's the real challenge. If you don't solve that problem, then you only have two alternatives. You either decide to ration social care and you just say, there aren't enough workers who we're not going to pay any more for it. There aren't enough workers willing to do it. So we'll just have to say to a number of people, you're not going to get any care, which is kind of what we've been doing for the last 10 to 20 years. Or you say, well, let's bring in migrants who are willing to work at those lower wages, because again, from their perspective, it's still a good deal for them relative to where they're coming from, and essentially take advantage of the fact that we can bring in those workers on lower wages. The problem with that is that those workers, there are two problems with that. One is that that might still be quite fiscally costly to the UK, and so particularly if you let them bring dependents with them. You've got to think about that. You've got to think about the fact that if you're a care worker coming in, you're bringing 2 or 3 kids with you, that's really costly for the rest of that's costly for the exchequer. And you should incorporate that. And it's almost certainly the case that if you just paid care workers better, that would be a better way to solve that problem than the roundabout way we do it. And the other problem, which is a really serious problem, is that in general, after 5 years, if you're a care worker, you can apply for indefinite leave to remain, settle in the UK, and then you don't have to work in care at all. You can work anywhere you want. And the problem is, at that point, why would we expect migrants to do something different than British people are doing? So why would they not go and work for Aldi at £2 extra an hour? The reason they can't at the moment is because you're not allowed to switch to a visa with Aldi to be at stocking shelves because they're not allowed to use the visa system. But after they get indefinite leave to remain, they will do. So it's a short-term solution to a problem that's fundamentally about funding. And I understand why it's easier often for politicians to decide to do the easy thing that won't cost any money and seems to be costless, but it's not costless in the end, and it just puts off the basic problem.
I'll maybe talk a bit more about Scotland and immigration then. You'll be aware that I think politically up here, the perspective has been quite different. I mean, all the political parties, including the Conservatives, have felt that Scotland needed more immigrants. Certainly that's been the conversation until recently, whether the rise of reform in Scotland as well in the polls, and it looks like they could end up with a bunch of MSPs next year. We had the Hamilton by-election where there was a tactic with Anas Sarwar of trying to use his race to undermine him. So that has had a bit of an impact on how we're talking about immigration in Scotland. But certainly up till now, the view has been our demographics are not great. We've got an ageing population and potentially a shrinking workforce to pay for them. We have rural depopulation. We have lots of seasonal work. Therefore, we'd like more immigrants. Now, as you said earlier, there's a tension there between what Scotland wants/needs and perhaps what other parts of the UK want/need. Perhaps there's been a slight danger that immigration has been seen as something of a silver bullet up here to tackle those demographic issues. What's a realistic view of what immigration could do for Scotland, and what would be your take beyond it?
Yeah. So it's definitely true that the demographics in Scotland are different than the UK, although a lot of that is actually it's happening earlier in Scotland than it will do in the rest of the UK. So the population decline that you will see in Scotland, depending on what you assume about net migration, but with reasonable assumptions, you'll actually begin to see a population decline. You'll also begin to see that in the rest of the UK 10, 15 years later, unless you change the amount of migrants you have. Similarly, the relative aging of the population, slightly more advanced in Scotland, but it's the same process. And it's frankly nothing special to the UK. It's true again in almost all advanced economies, and often actually we're not as badly positioned as some other countries. I mean, Japan is again the famous example where population is declining at a reasonably fast rate every single year. And so really the society is shrinking. We're not there yet at the UK level, but we'll get there depending on where we let net migration go to. So I think kind of the same demographic story is going to be playing out. I think one thing is that almost all serious demographic research that I've ever seen says you cannot use immigration to fundamentally solve that problem. Particularly the one that's probably the most important. The size of the population, I'm less kind of excited by. I mean, I can't remember the numbers for Scotland, but for the UK, I think we're at about 68 million people. Why is that better or worse than 65 million? Why is the number so important? So I'm not really very bothered by the size of the population too much. There are arguments for and against a bigger, you can actually put up a perfectly decent economic argument for a smaller population. So I think kind of I'm less bothered about that. The aging thing is much more important. The dependency ratio issue is much more important. And there I would make 2 points. One is that immigration can help to an extent, but often what it can do is it can try and stop some of that increase in the dependency ratio. It's very unrealistic to expect it to reverse the whole increase that you're going to see. And that's for two reasons. One is the size of the immigration flow you would need to get the dependency ratio to stay still for the next 15, 20 years. At the UK level, that's inconceivably large. Like that would be a net migration number that I don't think any politician would accept. I think even in Scotland, there begin to be questions, even if politicians are more liberal in general on net migration. I think there'd be a point at which they say, is that really what we're going to have every year? The other problem is that people sort of forget, and it gets back to my point that rather boringly, migrants are like us. And the only thing you can really definitely predict about a migrant who comes to the UK is that they'll age just like us. It'll be a year every year that they'll get older. And so you think you're solving the problem, but actually all you're doing is pushing it along another 20 or 30 years because you've brought in this enormous chunk of 30 to 40-year-olds. Well, lo and behold, in 30 years' time, they'll be 60 and 70. And so if you think about that, there's only one solution then, which is you've got to be permanently increasing the rate of migrants coming in. So it's always a catch-up. It's like a Ponzi scheme almost, where you're kind of, so we'll have billions of people in the UK in the end because we'll be doing that. That doesn't sound right. The alternative is that you have really very temporary schemes. So this could work, but it would be a real change to what we mean by migration, in that you could just say, look, we're going to have a bunch of a few million 30 to 40-year-olds who we're going to let come every 5 years. They're going to be allowed to stay for 5 years. Then we're going to kick them out. And we're going to bring in another 5 million 30 to 40-year-olds. That would work in the sense that it would keep a permanently younger population of migrants. But it's quite different to what we normally think. It's much more like the guest worker scheme in Germany than it would be for our normal kind of, there's a route to settlement and then you stay. And then just the final thing on that, I think for me, the key policy objective actually is not a migration policy objective. It's that you need to basically, it's all very depressing, but you need to encourage more of us to work for longer of our lives. If our life expectancy is going up, very depressingly, if we want the same standard of living in retirement as we did 15, 20 years ago, relatively, we're just going to have to work longer. Again, it's this magical thinking that sort of says, oh, we can all live longer, but somehow magically we don't have to pay any more into the system. Somehow someone else is going to pay for the extra 5 or 10 years we're going to live, and we can still live at the same. That's not true. And so that's why the pension age rises over time with life expectancy in the UK. That's a good policy. It actually means, but where we're probably missing some work at the moment is where we're not very good at keeping people in their late 50s, early 60s in work. Too many, if you want to leave and you've got a good pension and you're happy, then that's absolutely fine. We don't want to stop people having freedom of choice. But I think there's a lot of work to be done in saying, actually, if you're 55, if you're 60, if you're 65, you've still got lots to contribute if you want to the labour market. And employers should think more flexibly, and they have to if immigration is more controlled, about, well, how do we get these workers in? And so just an anecdote to finish with is just after the pandemic, we heard a lot from hospitality who was saying, it's a complete disaster that freedom of movement has ended, because we would always get, young Spaniards, young French people to come and work in bars, and that was always great. And so it's a complete disaster. We're having to close pubs down or reduce the opening hours. And there was an element of truth to that in 2022. And then the year after, one of the big pub chains said, actually, we're having no problems this subsequent year. And one of the reasons was that they'd created an over 50s recruitment campaign, because they'd recognized that actually lots of bar work is really suitable for people over 50. Like it's not heavy lifting often. It's kind of, just customer service. And actually there's no reason why, and it's very flexible. So if you only want to work a day a week, 2 days a week, it works perfectly. And actually that's the sort of thing we need to encourage more thinking on.
Okay. Just remember, if you do have any questions for Brian, please do send them over on the chat function. I can't not mention the Scottish visa, the fabled Scottish visa, which never happens and never goes away. It's a sort of Schrodinger's visa. But there's obviously been a push from the SNP. They've been in power up here for a long time for a separate Scottish visa. Neither the Conservatives nor the Labour governments at Westminster have shown any interest in it whatsoever. I suspect Whitehall looks at the thing with some degree of horror as well. But the fact is the tax code now gives us the opportunity to maybe be a bit more specific about what we need in Scotland and who can come here, and whether we can persuade them to come, because of course they could have come before and didn't, or record on immigration is not brilliant. But how do you view the visa in terms of the arguments for and against, and where would you land if you're making the decision?
You're right, of course, that there's no practical reason that you can't have a visa that is restricted to a particular locality. I mean, as you say, it happens to be a little bit easier because there's a Scottish tax code. But actually, even if there wasn't, you could have rules that were in place that, said that a visa can only be held for a certain type of job or certain university if it's in the correct catchment area, as it were. So you can do that. There's nothing to stop it. I think the first thing you have to answer is what happened. One key question you always have to answer then is what happens at the leave to remain stage. Because you then get a complication, which is you think you've got a Scottish-only immigration policy, but at leave to remain, unless you're going to forbid them from travelling to the rest of the UK, you've now got a rest of the UK immigration question. And I'm assuming that no one would want to suggest that at the ILR stage, we suddenly stop having freedom of movement for some people around the UK as a whole. And so inevitably, the risk is, and here partly it would be about numbers, is, well, how many visas would the Scottish government want to issue? If they wanted to issue 5,000, 10,000, you might, if you were them, can't speak for the Home Secretary, but you might sit and say, well, even in the long run, that's not going to have much effect on net migration in the rest of the UK. But if they want to issue 100,000, it would begin to matter, because it would begin to matter about how many would move to the UK, to the rest of the UK after they got ILR. And although it's true that more people at the moment move to Scotland than from Scotland, the numbers are not massive either way, but that's that's not necessarily true of a migrant cohort, because as you quite correctly said, if you look at, often people say to me, oh, the immigration system is quite London-centric. And the way they argue that is they say, well, if you look at where migrants, say on the skilled worker route, if you look at where they go to, I can't off the top of my head, I think it's something like 65% of them go to London. 65%, something like that. And so people say, oh, so you've designed a system that really encourages people to move to London. The thing is, though, that that's also the same percentage that moved the Europeans who moved to London when we had freedom of movement, and they could move anywhere they wanted in the UK. It's not that, so often it's not about the rules that you set in place, it's where people actually want to live and work. And and so that's kind of it's offering the visa is not going to be enough. You want to make it, you're going to have to be attractive enough. There's also, there would also be odd complications that would be thrown up. It would see, there'll be part, if you think along the border, there'll be odd places where if you're on a town just north of the border, you'd be able to bring someone in, but if you're in the town slightly south of the border, you wouldn't be able to. Is that what's the rationale for that? What's the economic argument that says that's a good thing to do? So I think you can do it. Politically, as far as I can see, not a single Westminster government wants to do it. And so kind of, there's a question about what the relative benefit of spending time on it is when, seems to be something you have a chat with the Secretary of State when the new government comes in. If they say we're never going to do that, you probably just move on and kind of work on other things. But there's nothing to stop it happening. But I do think there's this thing about sometimes the assumption is that once these people get the time to stay permanently, they will all stay in Scotland. That might be true, and it might be worth doing as more of a pilot to see whether that is true. The one thing that I think that the one we've said in the past that we quite like the idea of experimenting with a kind of a remote areas visa. We think there's some merit, and that wouldn't just be Scotland. There'd be remote areas around the UK that would be eligible. But one of the things we said was it might be worth having a fairly small experiment to see whether once the conditions of being there finished and you got settlement, would you actually stay in those areas? Because our skepticism, I think healthy skepticism, is if you can't convince locals to stay in that area and they're all depopulating, why are you so convinced that an Indian or a Pakistani will come and will then be desperate to stay in that area? Why won't they do the same thing that everyone else is doing kind of by their own actions? And so, but it's an interesting question. There could be an argument the other way. It could be that they actually are a bit more sticky, and that they move in and they come to love the area, and they perhaps they see it with slightly different eyes than the people who've been there since childhood and think, God, there's nothing here. There's no cinema anywhere nearby. Perhaps they see different things, and so But I think it's one of those things where you would test it and see would be a sensible approach, I think.
Yeah, and I wonder how. I don't know the exact details of this, but in terms of selling Scotland to immigrants, whether there is a sense that maybe we haven't done quite enough on that front. I remember doing an event with some Hong Kongers who obviously after the Chinese crackdown were given a special route through. And I think they talked about various immigration fairs or whatever that had been there, and the UK government was in there, but there wasn't a huge Scottish presence. And if you don't have family members or there isn't a big existing community, you might not know enough to or take the risk to come. Are there things, I don't know if it's your area or not, but are there things the Scottish government could be doing to sell Scotland as a home for people more than it does?
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think, the reality is that, if you go, particularly from the countries that we're now kind of getting more of our migrants from, lots of them will know not a great deal about the UK. They'll probably know about London, and that's potentially about it. And so actually, it's, if in some sense there's an open market there, if you can't change the rules, so the rules are set nationally, but you can change the kind of the perception of those places. And so actually being able to go and sort of say, we're very welcoming, there are lots of statistics that you could present about the fact that in general it is true that Scotland tends to be more liberal on migration than kind of the rest of the UK as a whole. So, potentially you could use that as an argument as well. It's, it's a nicer place to come and be. Like that seems to me like an easy sort of thing well, not easy, but I think that's well worth doing. I mean, you see universities do this all the time. I mean, universities spend an awful lot of their effort in going out and recruiting internationally. And often universities that no one would necessarily have ever heard of from abroad, but they go out and do the marketing and get students to apply.
Yeah, and obviously there's been a lot of conversation about the student migration, partly based on the funding system that both sides of the border, although we have different funding systems for higher education, but certainly up here the conversation has been how reliant our universities have now become on particularly Chinese, Nigerian students, that sort of thing. Is that a sustainable model?
No, of course not. But it's exactly the same as care. And, I think of students, oddly, I think of universities and the care sector as being almost the same, in that it's the same basic problem, which is that we haven't solved the funding problem in universities. And so we're using immigration as a prop to solve that problem. It can't solve the problem in the long run. And I think we're pretty close here at the point at which the model is going to start collapsing, because I think even if we hadn't, I think the previous government were completely right to put restrictions in place on dependence of master's students coming out. I think basically we were selling a working visa to an awful lot of people at that point, which I don't think was appropriate for the sector. But even if we hadn't, actually, two things are happening at the same time, which will mean that we have to become less dependent on international students. One is that there's some pullback from some of our big markets in terms of interest. So particularly, Nigeria has gone through a currency crisis, and so we're seeing an awful lot fewer Nigerians coming to study. But also in China, the graduate unemployment rate is actually quite high in China. And the payoff to coming to do a British degree is significantly less than it was because of that. And because Chinese universities are actually some of the best in the world now. So why would you spend the money if you can go to a really great Chinese university? So we're seeing a bit of a pullback in terms of demand from international students. At the same time, all other countries are trying to do the same thing that we've been very successful at doing in terms of getting international students. And so, almost inevitably, our market share is going to decline somewhat. It's almost always happens to companies who are early in and get big market share, and then competitors come in and they chip away at it a bit. So I think we're already a bit over reliant. And we're seeing that now in that there are clearly some universities in significant trouble because their numbers are just not where they needed to be in terms of international students. Partly because of visa changes, but also because of these more broad demand and supply changes. And unfortunately, they are completely reliant on them in the sense that even small changes in the numbers who come can have very big effects on the bottom line because most universities are operating, close to break even. None of them are operating with a 50% surplus, and so you can actually manage quite a big reduction any one year. So it's a pretty tight margin. And so we have to solve that basic funding problem that we've got, which is that, and it's worse in Scotland than the UK and the rest in terms of how much are paid, how much fees go for domestic students. But it's true across the UK that we take the view that universities should, for some reason, run at a loss when they're teaching domestic students. Well, why do we make the university sector do that when, it's like saying as I said to journalists, I said, it's like saying to your publisher, oh, you have to charge only 10 pence for your newspaper because we think you should make a loss in selling it to British people. Like, no business does that. Why should universities be made to do that?
We've got a couple of questions here. Fran Holligan, are you with us? Do you want to ask your question? Or I can put it for you if you're... Well, Fran says you mentioned that people born outside the UK make up 15% of the population. What percentage do they make up of the working age population? And she also says, I understand your point that migration can kick the problem of an ageing population down the line. However, there are also migrants who never plan to stay in the UK permanently. Do we have any info on the proportion that plan to settle?
Well, it's a good question. So I don't actually think, again, it would be off the top of my head. I don't actually think there's an enormous difference between, so 15% of just the most recent statistic I have in my head is 15% of the overall population were born abroad. I don't think it's massively different if you look at the working age population. It's it tends to be it'll be much lower for the older people because that generation didn't have as big migration coming in. But it's not an order of magnitude different. It's kind of the same sort of ballpark. In terms of people who want to stay, I think and this is sort of part of where immigration policy is focused at the moment, is when you think about net migration and sort of whether it's adding to the population, the two things you think about are how many people come in and then how many of them want to stay. Because you could let in lots, but if they all leave, then it doesn't fundamentally change anything at the end of the day. On the work routes, the main work routes, about 75% of people who come in end up staying. And by staying, I mean are here about at least 8 years after they enter. And usually that means they're going to be here permanently. So about 75%. For students, it used to be really low. So in the old days, it used to be about 10% of students would stay because obviously most of them are just doing their degree and leaving. Because we've now got the graduate route, that gives them a route that they can then use to get into work and stay. And the number's gone up now to more like 25 to 30%. And that's obviously one of the big concerns for the government, which is the number of visas we issue for students is a big number every year. It's like 400,000. If you go from only about 10% of them staying to about 30% of them staying, that has a fundamentally different impact on net migration in the long run. And so that's been a key focus. And then, of course, asylum and family, if you come in on either of those routes, it's close to 100% because you're coming for non-economic reasons. And, obviously not everyone stays with their family in the long run, but most do. So.
We had the Fresh Talent Initiative in Scotland under the Labour government in the early 2000s. And I think Labour are talking about bringing some version of it back were they to win the Holyrood election next year. What was your judgment of that project?
So the Fresh Talent, remind me what the Fresh Talent
so it allowed students to stay on for a few years after they'd got their degree.
Okay. Fine. I mean, we've sort of got that already. So the graduate route allows that. So it allows you now that they're about to change the rules. It's going to be 18 months rather than 2 years. So you can stay on after graduation for 18 months in any job, or indeed no job. You can just stay in the UK. There's no real restriction. And then the deal is that after that 18 months, you're going to have to switch onto one of the other routes, mainly the work route, if you want to stay. I think that's broadly I think that's broadly right in that if you're a graduate, these are mainly most master's students, most international students now are master's students. So I think if you've got a master's degree, if you qualified and got your master's degree, then I think it's reasonable to say you've got 18 months where you could do anything, or you could start to look and try and find the job that you want to get you. But if at that point you can't get a graduate level job that meets not outrageous salary thresholds, but, reach salary thresholds that, with a bit of a discount that you should be able to meet. I think at that point, we have to ask the question, well, why is that beneficial to what's the advantage in someone who went to university, got a postgraduate degree, and then can't get a graduate job after 18 months? It's not clear why that's really beneficial to the UK economy for them to stay, rather than for other people to come in. I mean, there's not quite a zero-sum game, but if we're being more generous to those migrants, we potentially have to be less generous to other migrants who might have better skills, a better match for jobs in the UK. So it's, we shouldn't, I think sometimes there's a risk that we think of visa routes as being used as almost like a subsidy to the university sector. We shouldn't be selling studying in the UK by saying, oh, well, the benefit is you get lots of work rights attached to it. We should be, if we're selling university courses, it should be because of their excellence and what they're worth to the individual.
On that point, Sarah asked, do you think students should be included within the overall migration statistics? Doesn't it distort the perception of the figures?
Yes, they should, because they're people. So this is the one that fortunately ministers have been, all ministers that I've ever spoken to have been absolutely adamant about this. The idea that we should just start deleting people from the statistics. I mean, there are two problems with it. First is they are people. So it's, why is that any more legitimate than saying anyone called John shouldn't be included in the net migration statistics? Let's choose a random demographic and just exclude them. So, it makes no sense. If they stay, they're part of the population. They take up just as much space as a skilled worker does. So yes, they should be in. The other reason is that when you start taking things away from published statistics, you don't change the truth. You just change everyone's perception of the honesty of the statistics. And I think you want to be really careful about doing that. By saying, what do you think the people would say if we said, oh, we've suddenly reduced net migration by 100,000? Oh, the reason we've done it is we've just excluded 100,000 people. Like, no one believes that. All it means is that people say you're a bunch of liars. So let's not do that. Let's keep statistics where they belong, in an independent agency who makes decisions based on analysis and international norms. And let's not let us change the measure just because it suits our story that we want to tell.
I'll just finish with a point from Michael Moe, who says on my Hong Kongers point that we have more than 10,000 BNO visa Hong Kongers in Scotland, the majority of them in the Central Belt. Total applications 190,000. He says he's working on the statistics, but there are more trying to move to Scotland from England, as they offer home fee status in Scotland, not so in England. What's home fee status?
I assume that's for universities.
Right. Yeah, right.
So actually, that is right. I mean, it's an interesting example. I hadn't realised that. It's an interesting example of, although you can't change the immigration rules, what Scottish government can do, of course, is change lots of other things that may or may not benefit migrants more or less. And so if it wants to, it can use, perhaps the Scottish government has gone the other way. But one thing you could do is, of course, you could change the tax system to make it more attractive for people to want to work in Scotland and the rest of the UK. I'm not quite sure that's how the tax system currently works in Scotland. But, you could play around with that. And so there are levers that the Scottish government can pull that will make it more or less attractive for migrants to go to Scotland than the rest of the UK. And they're all perfectly legal because they're devolved matters. They can't change the actual rules for immigration, but there are options there for them.
Okay. Well, I think that's probably a good point to leave it at. Brian, thanks so much for that. It was absolutely engrossing, and I think we've managed hopefully to bring a lot of light where there's often too much heat. And I'm sure everyone feels much better informed about the reality of the immigration system in the UK and the options that are there. So thank you very much for being so generous with your time. And thank you to everyone who's joined us. And we will see you all again soon.
Pleasure.